Hello and welcome to another episode of Pakistonomy. My name is Uzair, and today I have the honor of having with me Dr. Ammar A. Malik, who is a senior research scientist at AidData. He leads the work around tracking underreported financial flows, which is the program that he's head of. And they've done a lot of research around figuring out, tracking, analyzing underreported financial flows from international donors to developing countries. And recently, Ammar and his team came out with a fantastic report, which is linked below in the description, called Banking on the Belt and Road Insights from a New Global Data Set of 13,427 Chinese development projects. I think it is a fascinating research study. I think everyone should read it. And I think, and correct me, Dr. Malik, if I'm wrong here, but I think it is the most in depth study of its kind related to the Belt and Road Initiative, which is led by China. So, first of all, amazing work. Thank you for putting all this research out there for us, and welcome to Pakistonomy.
Thank you very much, Uzair. I'm really glad to be here.
So I spent a lot of time over the weekend reading this report and trying to get a sense of, how things have changed. And, you take a global view around what have the Chinese done, what they were doing before the advent of the 21st century, how things changed with the BRI. Many of the listeners here are aware of BRI, particularly through the lens of China-Pakistan Economic Corridor. So maybe why don't you start with giving us an overview of what the key findings were and how has China sort of changed its role in international development over the last few years?
Thank you, Uzair. Maybe I'll spend a couple of minutes just describing for your viewers, what we're doing and why this is important. So basically, as you know, after the Second World War, the group of lenders from the G7, which is called the Paris Club, set up a system of reporting to each other. So whenever, let's say, the United States or Germany did any aid project to a place like Pakistan or India, for that matter, they had this commitment that on a standardized reporting format, which is managed by the OECD, which is an organization in Paris, that they will report it and make it public so that there's better coordination among the donors. Developing countries know what they're getting, and then they can begin to make better decisions about what's working and what's not. Now, in comes China since the turn of the century, 99, 2000, when they had this going out strategy. And of course, China is all about trying to come up with an alternative vision of what this is. They don't play by the rules that have been established by the Paris Club. And therefore, they do not report on any of their aid activities. The OECD, they feel they're not obligated to do so. So what that leaves us is with a huge information gap on which developing countries are getting what kind of financing from China, when, how, and where. So this effort at AidData, which is a research lab at William and Mary, has been going on since 2013, where we basically systematically review projects using official and open source methods to try to understand what is China financing, what, where, and when. So this gives us and decision makers around the world a comparative basis where they can do apples to apples comparisons between what G7 countries are funding around the world and what the Chinese are funding. Now, having said that, I'll maybe spend a minute describing the scope of the study that you've mentioned. First of all, you're right that this is the most comprehensive study undertaken, and this is underlined by a data set which contains 13,427 Chinese projects funded between 2000 and 2017. Many of them are still ongoing. Our data set covers 165 countries, and the total financing that we've tracked is $843 billion. When I say it is comprehensive, it's more comprehensive than other data sets that are out there, both in terms of the sectors that we cover. So we cover energy, hard infrastructure, soft infrastructure, everything under the sun. Secondly, we cover all countries of the world, low income, lower middle income, upper middle income, etc. And also we cover all kinds of Chinese financiers. Some data sets that are out there will only cover the two big Chinese policy banks, but we also cover Chinese entities which are state-owned. Sometimes they're parts of their provincial governments or state governments. To give you a sense of how many institutions and entities we're talking about, in our data set, we have over 5,000 named institutions, both on the implementation side and the financing side, that are involved in this. We have 70 variables which cover for each of these projects, cover how much money is committed, what sector it is in, what's the status, when did the project start work on the ground, when was it completed, where are the projects located, what kind of funding this is. Is this commercial lending or debt, or is it aid? And if it is lending, then what is the interest rate, maturity, grace period, etc. And with each of these projects, you will also see on our website, aiddata.org, that we have done what we call cradle to grave project descriptions, about 2 million words worth of text, which basically tells you the story of what each project is like. Now, having said that, let me come to some of the findings. There's a lot in there, Uzair, you were talking about, but I'll give maybe 3 or 4 big highlights, and we can dig deeper into whichever aspects you're most interested in. So first of all, because we are now able to track Chinese spending on the same basis as US and others are doing, we have the same criteria, we have the same allocations of sectors. We are now finding that China is now outspending the United States by 2 to 1 basis around the world. And it is outspending the United Kingdom on a 7 to 1 basis around the world. Now, what this means is that until the start of the Belt and Road Initiative, which China launched in 2013, the US and China were around $32 billion of development assistance around the world. Today, China is hovering at 85 billion and the US is around 40 billion. So this just gives you an idea of the scale at which the Chinese have done this. And I can talk more about how they've done it and why they've done it. But basically, another standout feature of Chinese development finance is that since 2013, the ratio of loans to aid from China is 9 to 1, which means that unlike the United States and the UK, who are much more in the business of providing aid, China is doing much more lending, debt, almost like commercial financing, and that gives them the ability to provide infrastructure projects that no other entities are able to provide on like commercial entities like banks and so on. And that really has been how China has ramped this up. A typical overseas loan from China has a 4.2% interest rate that we've found in our data set. And compared to that, a typical loan from, let's say, Germany, France, or Japan has a 1.1% interest rate. And that's because they are doing this on a highly concessional basis, where Chinese lending is more like commercial lending, as I said. Now,
so in essence, sorry to cut you off, just for the listeners, essentially the second findings top line is that for every $9 China gives in loans, it gives $1 to these countries in aid. And the loans that it's giving are basically 3 times more expensive than what Japan, the European Union, and others tend to give on average to the same countries. So it's a lot of loan and it's a lot more expensive.
That's exactly right. And whether this is in the best interest of developing countries or not, I think we can have a discussion on that. But right now I'm just describing the scale of this and why they're doing this. Now, our finding is, you talked a little bit about debt trap diplomacy, and we were discussing, what actually means. What we're finding in our research is that these Chinese state-owned lenders, I'm talking about, banks that are commercial, owned by Chinese government or policy bank, they're basically what we call yield maximizing surrogates of the state. They provide very profitable revenue generating projects, which are commercially viable, and they just need some support to get going. But I think that's really very interesting and something that we have to wrap our head around. It is not like the Chinese are coming in with some kind of a grand strategy to take over the world and grab assets. I think they're just very savvy investors who are making some decisions. But it is definitely the way that they're doing this is making it's in this murky terrain of aid and commercial financing, somewhere in the middle. And I think that's what I think is quite interesting, and perhaps not a lot of people understand that. Now, the backstory of this is also quite interesting. After the 2008 financial crisis, we saw that the Chinese, and this is before the Belt and Road started in 2013, we saw that the Chinese state basically started to realize that all of their dollar and euro money that was sitting in US Treasuries was not going to give them as much of a return because of quantitative easing in the US. So I think we have to understand that they were looking for to solve what I think are a couple of very important domestic problems, a response to which is perhaps all of this money being sent out. The first problem was an oversupply domestically of steel production and just generally construction capacity. And they were looking for opportunities to deploy that capacity, and they did it overseas. Similarly, as I said earlier, they had this oversupply problem of dollars and euros, and perhaps not good opportunities to invest those euros and dollars in US Treasuries. So I think they were trying to solve both of these problems, and then the BRI helped them achieve that. Now, the other interesting thing, as if I go back to what I was saying earlier about the loans, was that the Chinese state-owned lenders seem to be favoring a lot of collateralization when they lend to countries which have a very high risk, or high fiduciary risk. So we find, for example, in our study that 83% of China's collateralized lending supports countries which are within the bottom quartile of global index of fiduciary risk. So they're quite savvy lenders when it comes to taking on risk and how they want to deal with that risk. And we also find that when it comes to collateral, they have a very strong preference for liquid assets, which do not require them to go to a court in a given country to gain access to an asset, whereas they're also doing a lot of bank accounts and having countries maintain minimum cash balances in lieu of the lending that they're doing. So overall, I think it's quite an interesting time to be studying this topic, and I'm glad that you and your listeners are interested in it. I'm happy to dig into any of these aspects, Uzair, based on your interest.
Yeah, no, Ammar, thanks for giving us that overview. I think these are very important points. So maybe I want to dig deep, starting with sort of this maximizing yield and the link to the US Treasury, right? I think I would love your thoughts, but from my point of view, that's a masterstroke of economic diplomacy, right? Because not only did the Chinese say, hey, wait a minute, we have this surplus of reserves in dollars and euros, by the way, which have been amassed because they've been running a trade surplus with these countries for a long, long time. So we have these dollars and euros, and rather than continuing to finance the budget deficits of the European Union or the United States at really low interest rates, because interest rates were cut to near zero in 2008. Let's use this to invest elsewhere where we get a better yield. And oh, by the way, as we do that, we can talk about the BRI as sort of this major global infrastructure development thing that the developing world needs. And that gets us influenced, right? How do you see that sort of like, do you see that as more of a strategic masterstroke as I described it, or was this a series of events that sort of led China in that direction because that just emerged as the default strategy?
I think it's more of the latter, because you may know this. In 1999, the Chinese introduced what they call the going out strategy. So this trend of more and more Chinese entities going abroad and making investments had already started at that time, and we see a fledgling program going on in the 2000s, even in 2006-7, for example, during the Musharraf years in Pakistan. We did get an influx in a first big influx of Chinese money, but it became much, much greater in 2008 and 9 and much more in 2013. So this was always going on. Of course, it helps to put all of these pieces together. I think that this is basically capitalism at play, where people have big amounts of state has big amount of money. It helps them solve a domestic problem, as I said, but it also helps them buy an incredible amount of influence in developing countries. And it also, frankly, helps export what I think is they call it like the China model of development, which is supply driven, hard infrastructure driven, rather than trying to invest in the software of development, which other donors have done for years, talk about women's rights and human rights and things like that. This is basically very hard stuff that gets built, and you can see it physically, and it comes with a certain kind of a mindset around supply supply driven development policy. The other thing that I think might be interesting for you is that we see that we also saw that as the BRI was introduced in 2013, a lot of these countries already had their balance sheets, not in a position where they were able to take on a lot more public debt. Today we reported in our findings that there are 42 countries around the world that have more than 10% of their GDP exposed to China as debt. So that's a huge amount of debt that these countries are taking on. So back in 2013, the Chinese basically made a strategic shift. And this goes back to your point about strategic shift, where they said, well, we will lend less and less to states and more to other kind of mechanisms, such as state-owned enterprises in host countries, or it could be joint ventures, special purpose vehicles, things like that, where a lot of this debt is now kept off balance sheet. So if the government of Pakistan or the government of Rwanda, for example, is interested in an energy project, the Chinese side will come with a China Exim Bank or some kind of a lender. They will bring a contractor who is willing to put that power plant. They will then create a joint venture or a special purpose vehicle where the government of that country will write a sovereign guarantee, which basically says, here's the commercially viable project, but if something goes wrong, we'll come in and bail you out. This, by the way, has just this week started happening and in Indonesia with the Jakarta-Bandung high-speed rail, where cost overruns were such that the Indonesian government had to come in and kind of bail out the project. In our report, we call this hidden debt. A lot of people, especially in Pakistan, have misunderstood what we mean by hidden debt. Basically, what this means is that because of the nature of these deals that you're striking, a lot of these debts are off balance sheets. And so international monetary institutions must, update their systems to be able to record these debts and to be able to report to them so that everyone can make better decisions about the true form of debt in these countries.
Yeah, I recall from my own research that, from 2011 to 2021, China's share of Pakistan's external debt has gone from about 4% of GDP, of total external debt to about almost 30%. And this is disclosed amounts, right? So this is just bilateral loans plus commercial bank debt, which is separated in the balance sheet that's shared by the finance ministry. But that required an IMF program for the government to fully tabulate that and share that. Now there's stuff in the power sector, there's stuff here and there, as you described in SPVs, that people have to put down together, but that's still confusing. But it still shows, despite that when a country owns close to 30% of your external debt, then you are in essence at their mercy if things go wrong. And which brings me to my next question, which is around collateralization. I saw in the report that there's countries like Venezuela, et cetera, that have heavily collateralized in terms of the funding that they've gotten from China. What does that collateralization look like? Is this, because from my point of view, when I was sort of as an uninformed person, if I were to think about collateralization, I would think about like, okay, the Chinese built the Sri Lanka Hambantota port, or there was something that went wrong there and the Sri Lankans cannot pay back, so all of a sudden Chinese take a 99-year lease. Is it like that, or how are these things structured on an average basis?
As I was saying earlier, there is a wide variety, obviously. So first of all, the reason why you mentioned Venezuela, it's because on fiduciary risk they're very high. That because of all the political turmoil, their relationship with Western institutions, and so on. So a place like this, we see that the Chinese are much more likely to use collateral as a credit enhancement technique. Other techniques are things like sovereign guarantee, like we have in the case of Pakistan. It could also be insurance. They also have a company called Sinosure, which provides insurance where you pay 5 or 6% of the capital amount of the loan you're taking, and they'll insure you against the risk of not paying back. As far as collateral is concerned, we are finding in our report that they're increasingly showing signs of being very savvy about it. For the riskiest countries, we see that they sometimes create what is called an escrow account in Beijing or in some other country which is controlled by the lender, in which the government is asked to put a liquid asset, cash, in the account against that loan as collateral, so that they can, if needed, they can basically put that in their back pocket and walk out of the door, right? So they don't have to go into litigation or acquire an asset which otherwise would not be feasible. I think this Hambantota example is cited quite a bit, and this has also created this narrative around asset grabbing, and especially in the African context. 5-10 years ago, there was a lot of discussion of how Chinese agricultural projects were all about grabbing land from Africa. I think it's not that. I think they're just, as I said, they're just yield maximizing surrogates of the state who are trying to do their best to protect their interests. So I think it's a very interesting situation where collateralization is being used more in risky places and in being used in very savvy ways. And the other thing, you might be thinking, why then, if it's so lopsided, why are these governments agreeing to these terms and conditions? And I think one of the reasons that we found is that the difference in the capacities of the two sides to negotiate, to understand the terms and conditions that they're agreeing on, is extremely different. The Chinese side, we've seen evidence, hire some of the world's best transaction lawyers. I'm not talking about Chinese lawyers. I'm talking about boutique law firms in New York and London and Paris, to write these contracts and make sure that in the case of a default, that they're the senior creditor, and that there are very watertight terms and conditions around disclosure of these debts and so on. So, but on the other hand, if you look at some of these developing countries, you have bureaucrats from ministries of finance who just don't have that kind of capacity or legal training to be able to understand what is it that they're taking on. So I think there's that aspect that also we need to consider as we think about this problem.
Yeah, I remember the watertight conditions being a problem because when, for example, the Pakistan Tehreek-e-Insaf, the ruling party in Pakistan, was in opposition, Asad Umar, who was sort of the shadow finance minister, used to talk a lot about how they want more transparency in the China-Pakistan economic corridor. And then when he came in as finance minister and the PTI came to power in 2018, the rhetoric changed, right? I think somebody probably sat him down and said, look, here are the watertight legal conditions, and your old rhetoric about being transparent is not going to do anybody any good. Because here are the terms that were agreed upon in this situation. From your point of view, also, another thing that stood out to me in the report was the fact that countries like Nigeria, Iran, Vietnam have super long timelines for implementation of these projects, right? So if I'm looking at the table here, Nigeria, average days to implement 9.1 years, Iran 7.1, Vietnam close to 5, Sri Lanka close to 5. Do you have a sense of why this is the case, where things are super slow? Because one thing that, again, we hear in popular media is that the Chinese are very efficient in getting things off the ground and completing these projects. So why is it the case that some of these countries have super long takes years and years for implementing these projects?
I mean, of course, there's a long list of countries and many, many projects that we're talking about, but I'll try to summarize it in sort of broad strokes. First of all, what we are seeing is that BRI projects, which are mostly hard infrastructure projects and have been undertaken recently since 2013, they are much more likely to run into these kinds of problems. We are finding in our data set that about 35% of projects have some kind of a major problem when it comes to implementation. It could be corruption scandal or controversy, environmental issues, a public protest, or just generally underperformance. And I think the reasons vary, obviously, but this trend is continuing because the Chinese are now implementing much larger, more complex projects that involve, larger activities sets on the ground. In a place like Pakistan, I think one of the reasons why some of the energy projects in coal that you mentioned earlier, they were, brought online in a matter of months, 2 to 3 years sometimes, because the government had this very strong sort of focus on trying to solve the energy crisis. And these, when they were brought in, they were given explicit instructions to say, good, we're going to give you very good terms and conditions, and we'll give you full political, administrative, financials, whatever support you need to get these online. And what we're seeing in some of these countries is that there's implementation problems happen. If there's a change of government during this time period, they would come out and say, we need to review everything. We saw this in Malaysia when Mahathir Mohamad became prime minister. He basically said, we're going to reevaluate all of these projects. And I think we saw similar sentiments even in Pakistan, with Razak Daud basically saying we're going to go and revisit these projects. In the case of Iran, I think we highlight this in the report also. It's very interesting that the U.S. sanctions have played a big part in this, whereas the Iranian and the Chinese side had come up with a way of circumventing those by creating alternative banking institutions that could operate. But then the U.S. regulators caught up with that, and they nipped it in the butt. So,
and I guess it also doesn't really help that a lot of the loans are given out in dollars, right? So it doesn't really help the Chinese circumvent when Uncle Sam catches up and gets smart about what's going on.
Absolutely.
The other thing that's super interesting, again, like you mentioned Malaysia, again, the table here is fascinating in the sense that according to your team's research, about 10 projects in Pakistan are subject to scandals, controversy, alleged violations. Malaysia has 5, but Pakistan's 10 is like almost $6 billion, while Malaysia is like close to 20 billion or 19 billion out of the 5. You mentioned Mahathir and what happened there. Can you tell us a bit more about like what exactly happened in the Malaysian context? Because I know a little bit about the fact that, again, there are some similarities around what's going on in Indonesia in the sense that Jokowi has staked his reputation to Chinese funding, etc. So again, have sort of like the lesson been out of these two countries that when the political winds shift and the nature of the conversation around China, its role, whether the money it gave was good or bad, like does that change around the world?
Yeah, that's exactly what happens, and I think not all of these changes are purely driven by political motives. In some countries there are very clear pro-Beijing and anti-Beijing sentiments in elections, and when governments change, things happen. But what we're seeing is that a lot of the trend that I'm seeing is both in Indonesia and Malaysia, for example, is both sides, both projects were allegedly overpriced. And they were sometimes considered to be vanity projects or too luxurious, something we cannot afford. Similar to what we saw, with the Lahore Orange Line project, which was like, why are we spending 1.2 billion on a metro rail project? Similar sentiment. Whereas in the case of Malaysia, what we saw was there was a change of government that happened. They put a pause to the project, decided to revisit it, couldn't come up with the deal, and so they ended up canceling the project. This is why you see the number being so high. We in our data set, we also study cancellations, by the way, and suspensions, which we think tell us a lot about what's going to happen. So I think that as around the world, I anticipate that as revenue streams for governments dry out during the COVID era, we will see that countries which owed so much money to China, their arrears are beginning to grow more and more. And so we will expect in the coming months and years, more and more cases like this, where either projects are being suspended or canceled, or governments are saying, we just cannot pay you back. So it would be very interesting to see how the Chinese side responds. So far, we have seen no evidence that they are willing to write off debts like it used to happen with the US and UK and others in the old days, where they would write off your debt and reschedule it. They're still saying, you still owe us that money in arrears with interest, but we're going to make it a little bit easy for you by extending the repayment terms and perhaps changing the interest rate a little bit, where basically you're paying out the same loan over a longer period of time. It feels like you're paying less back every year. But over time, the net present value of those loans is going to go up. So I think that's the trend that I'm observing. And unfortunately, I don't see this getting better in the months ahead. I think you'll see more and more cases like this happening around the world.
Yeah, I think that resonates with some of my own research related to Pakistan, where just a few weeks ago, the Pakistanis tried to renegotiate the power deals with the Chinese. And, in total, close to $1.5 billion US are owed in receivables to the Chinese. And there were rumors that Pakistan is pressing China to, hey, let's renegotiate the way we renegotiated with the domestic IBPs. And the Joint Coordination Committee met. And out of that, the press release was that Pakistan and China agree that there will be no renegotiation. I was like, well, basically it was Chinese telling the Pakistanis that there will be no renegotiation. You have to pay what you owe. To which then I was joking that with some friends that basically what might happen is a financial institution, a Chinese state-owned bank, essentially, will lend Pakistan $1.5 billion out of Beijing, which will end up in another bank's accounts in Beijing, which are run by the investors. And that will end up as a balance sheet item on the State Bank of Pakistan's thing as external debt. And that's how the loans will be paid back. And then obviously we will have things moving forward. Which brings me to Pakistan, because I know we're a bit short on time, and I want to touch upon Pakistan in the sense that you're from Pakistan, I'm from Pakistan, the listeners, a lot of them are from Pakistan. We're frequently told that, the Chinese relationship is higher than the Himalayas and deeper than the Arabian Sea, or whatever that line might be. From your research, have you seen any evidence that perhaps the way the Chinese have given Pakistan this money, or the loans that Pakistan has received, is in any way more concessionary than the 4.2% average rate that they've given to everybody else on average? Or is this Pakistan is part of the same sort of bucket?
No, in Pakistan's case, there's not interest rate is not the only variable. Of course, you have to calculate the actual cost of lending. You have to look into maturity and grace period and insurance and fees and all that stuff. But I think just interest rate is obviously very important. What we're finding in our data is that in Pakistan, the average interest rate is actually 3.76%, lower than the 4.2 that we find around the world. We also find 60% of what we call the CPEC portfolio is actually energy projects, and most of them were committed during the Nawaz Sharif years, between 2013 and 2018. Of course, generation capacity has expanded quite dramatically in that time period as well, which gets reflected in this. Yeah, so you can say in a way that it's better than the 4.2% that they're giving around the world, but we are still working into the details of the data to understand whether these interest rates are one better than what other financiers were willing to provide at that time to Pakistan, and whether the Chinese financiers were providing the same or better rates to other countries doing similar projects around the world. Of course, the risk profile of Pakistan in 2013-14 was also pretty much worse, I would say, than what it is now, mainly because of the security situation, but also other factors.
Yeah, I think that's what the previous government's folks have argued, is that at that time, there was no one coming to invest in the power sector in particular. And so we needed the power, and this was the best offer and probably the only offer on the table. And I think there's also some merit to the argument that a lot of this investment came in power. It boosted Pakistan's generation capacity. It fixed the supply side problem that was there. But in order to sustainably pay back the money that is now owed, Pakistan had to do certain actions, right? And its power sector reforms, its own economic reforms. And so long as those reforms aren't done, the problem will end up on the Chinese financing side in terms of we can't pay back the money. So even if it's 3.7%, it's a bit lower. Even if it's higher, my position always to Pakistanis has been, you've taken the loan and it was good money in terms of what you needed to produce and it met your needs. You need to make effective use of this power now to build your export side, to build your economy and generate the dollar revenues that you need, frankly, to pay back those US dollars. Last question I had for you on this overall thing. You mentioned that in the next few months and years, you see like sort of the yield maximization strategy, so to speak, I'm putting words in your mouth, be tested, right? Because here's a savvy looking investor at this point in time. But we know from the post-World War II era, as you mentioned rightfully, that the Europeans, the Americans and others and multilateral institutions have all sort of had this run up of debt, and then they realize that countries like Nigeria or the East Asian financial crisis happens, so they can't pay that money back, and then things change. What do you see from your point of view, or any evidence or your thoughts on the Chinese strategy in case that begins to happen, right? Right now, they're probably not willing to negotiate, but if sort of enough countries start being unable to pay, what do you see happening to the overall BRI in that instance?
There's a couple of thoughts I have, Uzair, on this. First of all, I think that, yes, you're absolutely right. This is something that's going to play out and nobody really knows what's going to happen. Even though our data only covers a commitment year until commitment year 2017, we did begin to see in the last few years of our data, 2015, 16, 17, that the Chinese are multilateralizing their lending, which means that the percentage of loans that are purely financed by either a single Chinese bank or even a group of Chinese only banks is going down. And they're increasingly now bringing even the likes of the UK's FCDO, Asian Development Bank, African Development Bank, Islamic Development Bank, to come in and create syndicates to provide these loans. So to me, this suggests that this is like a risk hedging strategy that they're implementing. Whether that means that they are also accepting the quote unquote norms of international order is yet to be seen, but that's one sign that's happening. The other thing, as we move forward to this COVID era and look at arrears, piling up, I think we're going to quietly start to see debt to equity swaps taking place. And I think that is, I don't know what form that might take, whether they will be made public or not, but increasingly to me, that sounds like the only viable solution. So in other words, if 75% of a $1 billion power plant was lent to a place like Pakistan, and the Pakistani side just cannot keep up with the payments, and they can see that their balance sheet cannot afford to do that. One solution is to increase your level of equity in the arrangement. And in the case of Pakistan, you mentioned the power sector. One of the most interesting aspects of this, which again is available on the NEPRA's website, is the equity that is gone into these power plants. Many of these are local suppliers like Habib Bank or Nishat Group or something. They are getting up to 35-36% return on equity, dollar denominated. So swapping your debt for equity may not be a bad deal, but under what terms and conditions that will happen, I think will be the big question.
Yeah, and I think in the Pakistani case in particular, there is a guaranteed dollar denominated return on equity, but it's not like the sovereign pays you on time. So that opens up another problem because the generation plant is separated from the distribution company. But I think you're right, there will be a reckoning, particularly in the Pakistani case, in the power sector, around privatizing distribution companies or power sector reforms that goes along with the equity stakes, because at some level, the sovereign will basically run into a position where it says we can't pay, and then that will be the onus for reform. But Dr. Ammar, this has been a wonderful conversation. This has been a wonderful piece of research. So kudos to you and your entire team for putting out this research for all of us to look at, because for years we've heard about the fact that BRI and the projects around BRI are shadowy and it's not clear what's going on. So this casts a light in an unprecedented way on what's going on. So thank you for that. Thank you for sharing with us your findings and your insights, and keep up the great work. And hopefully we'll have you soon again to talk about what comes next in BRI as these projects sort of hit the brick wall of reality, so to speak, when the repayments are due.
My pleasure, Uzair. Thank you very much. And we look forward to having more conversations with you in the future. Thank you for having me.
Bye.
Bye.